to the Utah Stories Show. My name is Richard Marcosian. I'm the editor and publisher of Utah Stories. On the program today is Nick Norris. He is the Salt Lake City Planning Director, and Nick is in charge of the enormous task of actually figuring out how to accommodate all the people who are moving to Salt Lake City right now. Salt Lake City is, in fact, a boom town. It's one of the fastest growing cities in the fastest growing state in the country. And it's kind of interesting what's going on because for the first time, Salt Lake City is becoming a much more urban and inhabited by urbanites. That's not been something that's been popular in Salt Lake. We were always a commuter city where the population would go from about 70,000 people during the daytime to over 1 million or close to 1 million, and during after everybody would come to Salt Lake to go for their jobs. And now people want to live, work, and play all in downtown Salt Lake City. So without further ado, Nick Norris, Salt Lake City Planning Director. Okay, I'm here with Nick Norris he is the director of the Salt Lake City Planning office. Is that correct?
Correct. Yep.
And I want to talk about 3 stories today. I want to talk about how the skyline of Salt Lake City is quickly changing, and we're for the first time seeing a lot of people who want to live and work and play all in downtown. And then I want to talk about affordable housing, and then we'll go into the fears that people have around density, about property values declining if we're doing all this building, some of the misnomers. So I think we'll do this in 3 parts. But first, thanks for coming in, Nick. Appreciate it.
No problem. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Cool. And so one thing that I'm really kind of interested in is why is there an affordable housing crisis? That's how it was labeled in an article in the Salt Lake Tribune. Actually, the Deseret News in August. Why do we have this shortage, and why is it a crisis right now?
Well, really, you have to go back in time, decades. And when you look at the growth that Salt Lake City has had over the past 50 years, and what has and has not been developed over that time, you'll start to see that as our population grew, we weren't building housing to accommodate that. And so historically, going back to really 1995, that's the year that the city did a comprehensive zoning rewrite that essentially downzoned most of the city where you could build housing. And so it made it harder to build the types of housing that the city needed to accommodate the growth. So in 1960, we had a population of roughly, I think the number was 160,000 people. Well, we had that same population in 1990. And so, 1960 we were about 190,000. In 1990 we were about 160,000. So we lost 30,000 people over a 30-year period.
No kidding.
By 2010 we had gained all that back, but in that 20-year period we had not been building housing. And so,
when you're saying housing, are you talking about houses or just like residential apartments, or everything?
Everything.
Okay.
Everything. So we saw this big growth in people, but we weren't seeing the change in housing. And so that really is what started our housing affordability. And if you talk to people, and you'll hear stories about how they bought their house in the late 90s for maybe $40,000 or $50,000 or $100,000. Those same homes now are $400,000 or $500,000 or $600,000. And so that exemplifies that problem. And so that really led up to a lack of housing supply to meet the demand.
Mm-hmm. So it's essentially just a problem of supply and demand. There's way more demand than there is supply.
Yeah, big picture, absolutely. But there's also some nuances to it. I don't think you can talk about housing affordability without talking about household income. Salt Lake City, for a variety of reasons, generally has a lower household income than the rest of the county. And when you start to think about why that may be, you start to kind of understand it a little bit. We have virtually every student housing. Basically, if you live on campus, if you're a college student and you live on campus, in Salt Lake County, you live in Salt Lake City on the University of Utah. We have most of the, if not all of the, with the exception of some in Midvale, the homeless shelters and the homeless populations. And so all of those things, we have a huge refugee population in Salt Lake City. So all of those things help keep our household incomes low, which means we are influenced by more than just the market demand. And so that helps contribute to the housing affordability issues that we're facing.
And something that I've thought about for a while is it just doesn't seem that there's a lot of people until recently that really wanted to live downtown, because downtown, it's kind of been known to be sort of, I don't know, a little seedy still, and a little bit, as you said, there's just there's a perception that it's lower income housing, mostly downtown, just until recently. But what's happened just in the last 5 years that's caused this real big spike in people wanting to live in apartments and condominiums downtown?
Yeah, a lot of it is just some general preference changes that people have. So if you look at our two largest demographic profiles, not just in Utah, but really in the country, on one end we have the baby boomers. On the other end we have the millennials. And they tend to, a good chunk of those tend to want to live the same way. And so both of those people, both of those groups really are looking at more urban type of living. It's really the proximity to various amenities and resources and activity levels without having to necessarily take care of a yard or worry about, going through traffic to get to the grocery store, things like that, that really are starting to change that perception. The other thing too is, and for downtown, it really is, we finally are starting to see the city's plans and ideas start coming to fruition. So for 20 plus years, the city has always, or has viewed downtown as the place where growth should happen. And I think as a city, we kind of took for granted what urban growth means for a long time. And within the last 5 to 10 years, we've started to recognize how difficult it is to actually finance and build and provide utilities for urban growth. And so I think we've learned a lot as a city and collectively as a city, I think if you look at where cities like Denver were in 1980 and with virtually no one downtown and being a city full of parking lots and what they are now. You can look at Austin, Texas and Seattle and Portland and a lot of these other cities that are starting to see a growth in urban development. Even the major cities like Los Angeles is starting to see a huge growth in their downtown.
Yeah, and what I've kind of been surprised by, we looked up the statistics because I tend to go to Denver and compare it to Salt Lake and realize, wow, Salt Lake's small.
Yeah.
And I thought, but Salt Lake, it's catching up to Denver. But then I realized by looking it up, Salt Lake is like ranked number 112 on the list of most populated cities. And why is it that we have such an anomaly here where we actually have such a low population density in downtown compared to so many other urban areas?
Yeah, a lot of that is because just the nature of how cities incorporated. Like you mentioned Denver. Denver is the city and county of Denver. And so they're a big anomaly. I mean, just imagine if it was the city and county of Salt Lake, it'd be a totally different story. But we are a relatively small geography and a relatively small population.
Why aren't we a city and county in one like Denver?
Historically there's been efforts to try to do that, and it just hasn't happened. It just the political will of the community just hasn't been there to create one big city that would be the city of equivalent of Salt Lake County.
Because the county seems like sometimes at odds with the city, right?
I think anytime you've got a number of local governments, we often compete for the same things, and we have our own ideas about things, and so there is some natural headbutting, I think, with that. I'm not an expert on the politics of the 70s and 60s and things like that when when a lot of these decisions were made. But we live with what those decisions are now, and we try to move forward. But it's very difficult to compare Salt Lake City to a place like Denver or any of those other cities I mentioned, because we're a population of 200,000 people, and Denver's, I think, 600,000, if not more than that. Austin's the same boat. Even Boise is significantly larger than Salt Lake City from a population standpoint.
Yeah, but if you look at the Wasatch Front as a whole, it's incredibly urban, and it's just incredibly sprawling.
Yeah.
And do you think that's been to our own detriment because you're seeing less density? We're seeing more sprawl. We're seeing more need for freeways and infrastructure stretching out further.
Yeah, I don't think you can look at it in any other way other than our historical development pattern now is detrimental to our quality of life. And I think it's the job of planners, not just in Salt Lake, but along the Wasatch Front and throughout Utah, really to recognize that and try to figure out what we can do to try to improve that. And the first thing that jumps to mind, obviously, is air quality.
Mm-hmm.
And that air quality is a direct result. Sure, there's some natural impacts to that with our mountains and our valleys and things like that, but our development patterns are contributing significantly to that. And when you develop around the car and the use of the car, you kind of have to expect the impacts of doing that, and it's hard to change that. People have to change their ways of life and their preferences, and that's just one of the battles that we're facing.
Yeah. Do you feel like part of your job is to do a PR campaign where you're trying to convince people, look, because you can't find a parking spot in downtown, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be building in downtown.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I think that's where you get into some of the perceptions, because a matter of fact, we have more parking downtown than demand is currently asking for. It's just people don't know where it is, right? And it's harder to find it.
It's in City Creek.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. But there is some level of a PR campaign within our own community, and we can also be a model for our neighboring communities too. We have plenty of places in Salt Lake City that really have a suburban development pattern. There's no question about that. And if we can do things to help convert those development patterns to more of an urban pattern, it does change things, and it helps us basically address some of our growth-related issues, and growth in a way that is more responsible, that has less of an impact on our environment. I mean, I think, quite frankly, most people either stay in Utah or live in Utah because of the access to the environment, the outdoors.
But then we want to drive everywhere at the same time.
But we want to drive. We want that convenience, and it's been easy to get around in at least along the Wasatch Front. Until very recently, it's been relatively easy to move around. I think, one of the things that I think this last winter really demonstrated is that that's changing dramatically, and you could just look at what was going on in the canyons with people trying to get up to the ski resorts or the backcountry.
Yeah, it was insane.
And every weekend nuts. Was just
my brother was
crazy.
saying 2 hours wait to get up to Snowbird, even on a not even a powder day, regular day, and the population wants to go in the mountains, but they, of course, don't want to drive.
Exactly.
And so do you think that a lot of people just need to realize we got to sacrifice some quality of life for this growth, that you just have to realize it's not going to be the same?
I don't know if it's sacrificing quality of life. I think it's sacrificing some personal preferences. We can still have a pretty high quality of life even as we grow, if we grow in the right way and we're addressing the impacts and we're recognizing that, driving a car to every destination you're going to, might not be the way of life in the future. And there's biking, there's, as we continue to build transit, one of the things that Salt Lake City's recognized is that if we want the transit system that actually supports our city, we're going to have to pay for that, and the voters of Salt Lake City just this past year voted to increase their taxes to help develop transit and to help support it. And it's, hopefully that is, we can demonstrate that works and improve, where we are now, but also maintain a certain level of quality of life.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing about growth is that if we growth in the right places, it's meaning that we are preserving our surroundings and our farmlands, our natural lands, our waterways, our canyons, because we can concentrate that growth instead of having it sprawl out into some of these valleys that are just starting to see the impacts of growth and sprawl.
Yeah, and I kind of see your job as being extremely difficult because we've reported a lot on farmers, and especially the farmers trying to save their farms that are right on the Wasatch Front corridor next to I-15. And what I find, a farmer named Verl Cook, he's got a big farm and greenhouse right off I-15 and Vineyard. He's like, the governor never met a farm he didn't envision a big box store being there. It's just like the state leaders are all about the economy and just building and booming the economy, and they really don't have concern over open space farmland and a lower usage for land that could possibly be a much greater economic driver. Is that a battle or a contention you guys face?
Yeah, we don't see in Salt Lake City as much on the agriculture side of things, but we see it in other ways. And if we continue to take the approach and do the things that we've always done and expect things to turn out differently, then we're fooling ourselves. And so we need to take different approaches. I think where we see this booming economy really impact Salt Lake City is on the housing supply and demand. And so that's one of those things that's driving our housing costs up. And, we talk a lot in planning circles about the various tools that, whether it's inclusionary zoning or other things that we can do to offset that. But one of the issues is that you're putting the cost on the people who are already building housing, which doesn't seem to make sense when the impact is really coming from the commercial growth, the tech sectors, things like that. That's really is what is bringing in workers and driving that need for housing up. And so to balance that side of the equation with having a good economy is also a good housing policy and good housing supply. And without those two things, eventually you're going to run into some issues.
And it seems to me they're doing a lot at the city to try to create more affordable housing and create more incentives for developers to build more affordable housing, but it doesn't seem like that many developers are taking the bait because I'm looking around Sugarhouse where I live and I'm looking for the affordable housing and I'm like, I just don't see it. It's really expensive.
Yeah, one of the challenges with affordable housing is that building an affordable unit costs just as much as building a market rate unit. And so trying to fill that gap and that difference between what is affordable to somebody who makes $25,000 per year versus someone who makes $60,000 per year is a huge difference. And that's really where the crux of the whole issue is how do you fill that gap so that people can support that? We are looking at a number of tools. I mentioned inclusionary zoning. We're trying to find programs that have worked in places that are very similar to Salt Lake City. But we also need to realize that, and I said this earlier, is that we had basically 20 years of growth without even providing market rate housing for that. So one of the things that is happening is that those people who can afford a higher level of housing are occupying the units that in the housing stock and supply that is really intended for lower income households. And so there's many pieces to doing that. Part of it is increasing the housing supply at market rates. But part of it also is trying to preserve I think preservation of existing affordable units is a huge thing that in the United States is really challenging to do.
Well, how do you do that besides passing laws?
Yeah, and I think that's it. I think it's passing laws, incentivizing some things. One of the things that we're looking at is if somebody's coming in to redevelop and they are either preserving or replacing a unit that's affordable, to give them density bonuses if they maintain that same number of unit at that same level of affordability. And so we're trying to find more of an incentive-based approach.
That seems a lot better than trying to do what like New York did with fixing rents. Like, do you envision that being a solution?
I have a really hard time imagining that being a solution. given Utah's outlook on development rights, and so I think that's in property rights. I think that's a really tough thing. But you never know, right? And I mean, if we don't see any kind of improvement over the next 10 or 20 years, things become that much more drastic and that much more important. And so you never know what's down that road. But what we want to do is try to get things in place right now so that we're softening that potential drastic level. And so it's really kind of an incremental approach to addressing the problem. But
one thing
but
I'm
we have some
wondering-
big challenges.
So I was looking at building heights, and I saw that in Denver they got about 9 buildings taller than our tallest building, and it seems like for years I see these residential buildings go up, but they're like 8 stories.
Right.
In Denver, you got like 20, 30, 40 stories residential towers. Wouldn't that create a lot more affordable housing if we just built higher buildings? Or if
Well, not necessarily, because the taller you go, the more the cost of construction goes up, and so there's a balance there for the on the developer side.
so
of
the
things.
developer could go taller, but they're not seeing that it would actually make them any more money if they did.
Yeah, basically that's a quick and easy summary. The reason why we see so many 7-story buildings right now is because that's the most cost-effective product that builders can build.
Oh, okay.
But if you look at the history of a lot of these other cities, there was a point in time where they were at the same place we are. And so we will start to see that happening. We've already started to get some interest in taller buildings in Salt Lake City. And we know that there's been a couple that have either been submitted to the city to build and been approved or in the process of it. But we know there's also a couple out there that are going to start to change the type of building that we've been seeing. We don't. The Liberty Sky project that's been approved on State Street between 100 and 200 South is going to be the first real high-rise for rent housing building that we've seen in the city in decades.
And how tall is that going to be?
I want to say it's right around 22, 23 stories.
Oh,
so
wow.
whatever that translates
That's
to.
about 3 times higher than ones in Sugarhouse.
Yeah. So it's going into that steel construction and things like that.
And that's Cowboy Partners, right?
That's a joint venture between Cowboy Partners and Boyer.
Okay.
And then we've talked to some other developers who are looking at similar, if not taller, buildings, and so we know it's changing. And that's kind of once all the easy parcels and the cost-effective parcels are developed, you start seeing the more expensive parcels to build on, the more challenging parcels to build on, start to come up on the market and become available, and see new construction happening.
And so it's clear that unlike how it was perhaps in the 90s, where the majority of people who lived in the Wasatch Front wanted the suburban style home with the white picket fence, that now we have this incredible demand for downtown urban living without any yard in an apartment or a condo. What's created that demand?
Honestly, I think it's a change in personal preference mainly. I think there's just a lot of people who don't necessarily want to have that single family yard.
Would you attribute some of it to the people moving to Salt Lake from other states, or a big part of it?
Yeah, that's part of it. I think there's more. I think one is the world is changing, and people are more and more connected than they've ever been to places that you never imagined you'd have a connection to, right? And so I think people are starting to have more experiences in urban settings and realizing that, either I lived in downtown City X for a year and a half and I loved it. Now I'm in Salt Lake. I want that same experience. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of that going on. But I also think that we are, to some degree, running out of land for single family homes. And so it's becoming more challenging. And I think that's one of the reasons why you're starting to see more high density proposed in the suburban cities and neighborhoods, which brings on a whole new type of pressure and issue. But I think there's some preference changes, and I think there's some economic changes.
Yeah,
going on.
Yeah,
as well.
more tech jobs.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll take a little break now, and when we get back, we'll talk more about a little bit of the history of the suburban growth and development of Salt Lake, and more about the demographics change of Salt Lake and the fear of density that people have here. The Utah Stories podcast is brought to you in part by the Made in Utah Brewers Fest. So this is happening very soon at the Gateway, and tickets are now selling extremely fast. We're probably going to run out of tickets, but I know we have about 200 left. They are $5 if you buy them beforehand, or $10 if you buy them at the door. So at this Brewers Fest, we'll have 10 local breweries and distilleries, including Saltfire, Strap Tank, Proper Brewing, Cervezas Zalupes, Vernal Brewing Company, Talisman. So like these are like the new kids on the block. They have the new formulas, the best new brews. It's really worth coming out and trying them. And it's going to be a European-style Bavarian beer fest where we'll have a big beer garden, lots of food, live music. It's going to be a huge party, and if you come in your favorite traditional European dress, you'll have a chance to win a really great prize. So visit madeinutahfest.com for more information on that, and I hope to see you there this Saturday. Okay, we're back. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of the suburban growth and development of downtown. I kind of find that a really interesting topic personally. I started Utah Stories with this in-depth examination of Main Street and how Main Street, downtown Salt Lake, was developed over the years. And I got interested because I looked at some pictures of the way Main Street looked back in the 40s and 50s. And it was this really amazing, vibrant street. It had all these local jewelry shops. It had shoe shops. It had Broadway music and Baker shoes and Wolf Sporting Goods and Cress and Auerbachs and it was just like this really cool street. And then within 20, 30 years, it just like all the life was just completely sucked out of the street, and you just had malls. Yeah, it's like, and then I just thought, how in the world did the city planning and planners and developers and politicians at that time think that was a good idea to build malls in downtown on Main Street? What?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is that if you were at the time, if you were looking at what was working in suburbs, and cities were losing population and tax base and people and all of those amenities to the suburbs. Mm-hmm. And I think there was this mentality that, well, if that's working there, why can't it work here? And I think that's why you started to see cities all over the United States take suburban approaches to growth and development, mm-hmm. and managing their cities. And you look at zoning regulations all over the place, including in Salt Lake City. Most of those are suburban style regulations. Mm-hmm. And it's had a profound impact on how cities have, really the decline of urban centers nationwide. That fortunately is starting to.
Zoning caused the problem.
I think, well, zoning was the tool that cities used to address what they thought was the issue. Yeah. And in hindsight, which is always 20/20, they were wrong. Mm-hmm. And now we're trying to recover from that wrong, right? And so, that's kind of the history of why things happened. Mm-hmm. Whether, at the time, I think you can see, if you try to put yourself in the shoes of the decision makers at the time, you can see where they came from. Yeah.
And I guess their knee-jerk reaction was, like, I looked at some of the stories back then, and there was all these signs overhanging Main Street. Yep. Like, you just would walk down the street, oh, wow, big sign, big sign, big sign. And they thought, oh, it's these signs, they're ugly. Let's get rid of them. Let's zone them out of existence. And actually, I think they made it far more interesting than how it looked after they got rid of them all. Yeah. And then I also look back at that era, and same thing that was happening, like you said, all over cities all over the United States was happening in Greenwich Village in New York. And this lady named Jane Jacobs, she actually decided to stand up against it. And this guy, I think his name was Louis Mumford, was all about building giant freeways into places.
Robert Moses.
Oh, Robert Moses. Louis Mumford was the filmmaker.
Another planner. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's like during that time period, you just saw these monolithic, big concrete structures being built. And I think that's at the same time we had our former city offices built that were so terrible looking. The only building that still remains is the old library, which is now Leonardo, but these giant concrete edifices. It's like how when you look back on that, were people so kind of short-sighted to what makes a city interesting?
I wish I knew. I think we all kind of look back at that era, those of us who are in planning, especially in urban areas, and try to, it's a head scratcher. Because there were so many signals that was really the wrong approach.
The former Crossroads Mall building.
I think you look at that as a perfect example. The what is now the Library Square block, which you brought up, and there's countless places that you can point the finger to and start figuring out, like, why was that viewed as better than what was there before? And I wish I had a good answer to it. But there were some things that rose out of that era. You mentioned Jane Jacobs and all of that, and that push to maintain that sense of community and all the benefits that it provided. Even in Salt Lake City, we have our historic preservation program because of that era.
Oh,
I think
really?
it started to wake people up, and who knows, maybe it wouldn't have been needed if we didn't take some of the approaches we had, and it would just be kind of an ingrained ethic in the community that you do the right thing with old buildings. But we still see it, right? We still see some of our great buildings demolished and replaced by things that aren't really contributing, to the urban fabric and the street life that you saw in downtowns in the pre-World War II era. We're trying to put safeguards in place so that when that does happen, it is better than what was going on in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
So as a planner and as you study planning and what Jane Jacobs rejected, how do you understand that deregulation actually creates that vibrancy, the lack of sort of planning?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is focusing on what actually is important. And, in the Salt Lake City Planning Division, our focus really is on that street level engagement. And that's where we feel like it's appropriate to have the regulations, is really, doors, what are they spaced at? The windows, what's going on in there? Signage, and downtown, if you're putting a flat sign on your building, no one knows you're there until they're right in front of your business. And then they're only going to you because you're a destination. And so if you're not a destination, you're not capturing that foot traffic. And so those are the kinds of things that as planners we look for trying to address. Now we have this interesting phenomenon too, where we're starting to see the taller buildings and how they shape and create an image for the city, which also is important, but it's probably not as important as what's going on at the street level.
Yeah. Yeah, and one thing I'm interested too is our offices used to be on 3rd South Broadway, which is my favorite street in downtown. And I can see that all the old retailers and merchants who are there, they fear that just in the very near future, all the life and vitality of that street's going to be gone because the Ken Sanders area has been bought out by Ivory Homes. They're going to tear that all down, build up some residential towers. Is there anything that any tools you have in retaining the culture, vitality, charm of the best places we still have left?
That's one of the hard things about zoning, is it can only do so much. And so one of the things that we recently did as a city is we completely revamped our design review process. And so it used to be like downtown has virtually no design standards to deal with some of those things. And so we're trying to change that. So we created a new process, a bunch of new review standards that we look at to see if a building's checking those boxes before it gets approved. So hopefully that will help. and that's right now. That's our primary tool that we use.
So how does that translate into preserving local character and local businesses?
Yeah, that's the hard part. I don't know that zoning is necessarily the best tool.
Yeah,
at
I guess
doing
it's
that.
probably not.
Part of it is that there's different zoning techniques. One is called form-based codes, which really can be used on almost a block face by block face basis to help preserve some of what's desirable and have new stuff fit into that kind of pattern. So we've had some success with using that tool in other parts of the city. The Central 9th neighborhood is really where we started that, and we're starting to see, along 900 South, starting to see some really great activity going on at really good scale.
So you define what the block face is going to look like.
Yeah, it's the hard part. It's a lot of work and requires a lot of staff resource, working with the community to figure that stuff out, and working with the development community to figure it out. And we're also in our largest period of growth as a city that we've ever seen. So, just as an example, in planning, our January of this year was our biggest month in terms of land use applications that we've ever had in January.
Jeez.
And it was 40% higher than what we usually see in January. So we know that we have to respond to all these land use applications, but we also have to carve out time and resources to deal with some of these growth-related issues and preserving what's great about Salt Lake City and what adds character to it. But also accommodating all the people who really want to be in Salt Lake. And we want to be an inclusive city. We figure, I think the mayor's on record, I think the city council, our city master plans say this, that, if somebody wants to live in Salt Lake City or be in Salt Lake City, we want them to be here. Mm-hmm. And so balancing all those things is a unique challenge.
Yeah. How many people in your department?
So we have a total staff of 30. We have 21 planners, and the rest are managers who oversee the work and support staff who help make sure that we can do our day-to-day operations, because without them, we're lost. So,
Wow. Yeah. So we'll take one more quick break, and then when we get back, we'll talk about the fear of zoning and then also some of the big projects in the pipeline right now for downtown Salt Lake. Okay, so there's, I guess this is a misnomer, but a lot of people seem to believe that the church imposed a rule that no building could be taller than the church office building. That's not true.
That's never been true in Salt Lake City. It's an urban legend. In fact, in our central business district, we don't have a height limit. Mm-hmm. We have certain thresholds that require design review, but the sky's the limit.
Really? Okay. So buildings can be taller, and actually the Wells Fargo building is 2 feet taller.
That's right.
All right. So what are some of the most interesting projects that you've seen that are coming up? They're going to break ground sometime soon in the next year or so.
Well, I think there's a couple of good ones. Is the office tower that's being built just west of Harmon's on 100 South and State is a pretty significant project for the city because of the office component that it brings. It's a big building, 20-something stories tall, and so one of the challenges that we've had as a city, particularly with the tech industry, is having the office space downtown where they want to be. We've heard from a number of them that, we'd love to be there if you had it available, but we haven't had it available for whatever reason. We just haven't. It seems like once a decade we get an office building built. And so that's a pretty significant building.
Do you know what kind of tenants that might go in there, or who's
I think occupant? So the developer, City Creek Reserve, I think is the developer. They've been on record as saying they're seeking some tech tenants. So that's a big,
and that's the church arm building arm.
It's right? one of the for-profit arms of the LDS Church.
Okay, and then you already mentioned the 24-story residential tower on 151 South State, which is really close to that, right?
Yeah, it's just down the street from it. So we're going to have, both of those projects are anticipated to be under construction at the same time. So that's going to be a pretty significant construction impacts to block, really, of downtown. But there's some other projects too. Obviously, the convention hotel, which has been years in the making, it finally looks like it's going to happen, and that helps with the success of our convention center, and really that when that's successful, our restaurants are more successful, our bars are more successful, all of those things, our retail is more successful. So those are big, important projects.
How tall is that convention center hotel going to be?
I want to say it's right around 350 feet.
Okay. But it'll be one of the biggest hotels in Utah, or the biggest?
Yeah, I would imagine it'll be the tallest for sure.
Cool. And then another one happening again on State. I thought I saw 51 South State. So State Street's getting a ton of development, huh?
Yeah, State Street's finally starting to get that attention that, frankly, it's deserved for a long time. I mean, Main Street's kind of stolen a lot of been the center point and focus of at least of the city for decades, and now State Street's starting to see some more attention given to it.
How and why do you think that's happened? Why was it all on Main Street and now it's finally shifting to State?
I think Main Street, because it was the historic gathering point in downtown, and even though it went through its rough spot in the 90s, it still kind of had that allure. It had a lot of the historic buildings, and even though we've lost a lot of historic buildings downtown, it still has the greatest collection of them. And frankly, it feels like a much different street. You know, we in our planning office, we always talk about how Main Street and State Street are the same width, but they certainly feel much different.
They're the same width?
Yeah.
Wow.
So
I wouldn't have guessed that.
Yeah, most people wouldn't.
Would be a lot wider.
You know, but then you start thinking about everything that's happening in the right of way on Main Street. You've got the big wide sidewalks, the outdoor dining, the big planters.
Oh, but more sidewalk space on the width
that's right,
of Main
because
Street.
it's basically, and this is one thing that I think the city has done right over the years, is they've allocated equal space to people on foot and people on bikes as they have to people who are driving.
Okay.
And so it's a great example of what happens. You know, Broadway 300 South is starting to see some of that as well. Mm-hmm. So hopefully that can be maintained and expand to other streets in our city.
Yeah, I noticed that that when you drive down State, you get just a little bit to the south of the main area, and they just took off the facade of an old building. I think it's on 6th South and State heading north, and it says Stokes Brothers on it from like 1980s. Is anything happening as you go further south?
Yeah, there are some things. Not so much on State Street. But Main Street, again, is starting, you know, there's a couple of big projects planned right on the corner of 600 South and Main Street. The city recently participated with South Salt Lake, Wasatch Front Regional Council, and UDOT and UTA on what was called Life on State, which is really aimed at what State Street could be. And hopefully we're going to have some capacity in our office sometime this calendar year to start, adopting that plan, but also putting into place the supportive zoning rules and regulations that can make State Street become more of a people-oriented place. Now obviously it's a state road, so we need help and participation from UDOT for that to really ever change much, and you know, even just giving more space for transit and pedestrians on the sidewalks would be a giant step forward in helping State Street fulfill and be everything it could be.
But that's up to UDOT to.
UDOT plays a major role in it. It's their, their street, and
because
so,
that Sears block
yeah,
is kind of getting blighted. That like area around there. Is anything going to happen with that old Sears building?
Yeah, something will happen. So my understanding is that it's under contract with a developer who has done some work in downtown, and so. They haven't presented anything to the city yet, so we haven't really seen any plans. We've had discussions about what it could be, and they're talking about an urban-oriented development, so that's all good. And we want to make sure that it's as urban-oriented as that block deserves and that part of the city deserves. But there's also some smaller projects happening in there. I don't know if you've heard of the food alley.
Yeah.
That, I think they just recently, within the last few weeks, got their building permit issued. And so that project's moving forward. And all of those things are going to start bringing some of the life to that corridor.
That sounds like one of the coolest ideas I've heard in a long time.
Yeah, it's really great. And 900 South, just east of State Street, is starting to develop its own character and be a small, more local-oriented business district, which will benefit from more activity on State Street. And State Street will benefit from that as well, because it starts to create those unique places that people are really looking for an experience to be in.
Yeah, I think whenever the city is helping create like a incubation area for local entrepreneurs, then you see that vitality show up, like they did on the lower 900 South area. You just saw all these businesses come up, and like 2 breweries opened up.
Yeah,
Templeton Family Brewery along with Fisher on. And is that a process the city's involved in, or you just letting?
Yeah, it is. In the planning office, our role really is to kind of set the framework for that development and make it easy for those things to happen and remove the barriers. And then the other city departments, economic development has played a huge role in that part of the city, and everywhere really, and in helping small businesses and employers set up base in Salt Lake and set up shop and be successful. And so I think one of the things that's happening right now, so I've worked for Salt Lake City for 12 years, and I think right now the cohesion between all of the various city departments that are involved in the development world is as good as it's been, if not better. And so that's a testament to the staff at the city who views their job as helping the city become everything it can be.
Yeah, and we had Val Hale on here, who's the economic development director for the state of Utah, and he mentioned the 222 South building on Main. Goldman Sachs had 300 employees, and they were going to try it and see if they liked Salt Lake. And now they've increased their offices by 10 times. It's 3,000 employees, and he says now it's the 4th largest office for Goldman Sachs in the entire world.
Wow.
Did you guys have anything to do with that, or is that just that's the state economic
so planning?
office?
We didn't have much to do with that side of things, but clearly we found ways to set the framework so that building could be constructed, and that's kind of where we come in. So we start earlier in the game with these things than economic development comes in with the tools that they have, and recruiting and making the sales pitch of why someone should be in Salt Lake City, both at the city, the state level. So we're really kind of maybe setting a foundation for those things to happen.
Yeah, you help them break ground, and
we help get them to that point, and from there it's other arms of the city that do what they do best.
Yeah, well, it's cool to see. I think it's exciting, but I find around us that there is a fear of height, building height, and the towers that have gone in Sugarhouse. A lot of people are like kind of freaking out, including us to a degree, about the traffic and the infrastructure, toll that all this density is taking. Can you explain why there is a fear of density and how the city addresses those problems?
Yeah, I think the fear really is a fear of change. And anytime there's change, there's a certain level of uncertainty about what the outcome is going to be, even in the development world. And so I think most of it is centered on that. And people, and probably to some degree rightfully so, fear that they're going to somehow be negatively impacted by these things. And property values is a big thing that we hear a lot about. But the reality is that places like Sugarhouse are becoming more desirable to live in. And you can look at cities all over the country and all over the world that when there's a desire to be there, property values don't really go down when development happens and when change happens, provided that development and change is aimed at achieving some goal, right? And so, the Sugarhouse master plan, which was created in the early 2000s, really envisioned what is happening in Sugarhouse now. And it took, I think 12 years for the first project to get out of the ground. And now we're just starting to see get to the point where, frankly, everything that's easy to develop is going to be developed here pretty quickly, and it's become one of the more mixed use areas of Utah, and the vibrancy that's happening in Sugarhouse is if it's not more than downtown, it's getting there. And so that's a big thing, and a lot of that is because we do have limitations on the commercial development side of things. And so we hear a lot that we need to require mixed use and things like that. And to some degree we do, because the way the land values are versus what someone could make money off of, you almost have to do mixed use in places like that. So density really it's in my opinion, I think people are opposed to density because they're opposed to traffic. Mm-hmm. And if you have the tools and resources in place to provide all different ways for people to move around, then you're not going to realize the increase in traffic. But I think people also need to recognize that you hear the saying, "Oh, I'm stuck in traffic." Well, you're not stuck in traffic. You are traffic. You're contributing to that, right? You're in your car just as much as the person in front of you or behind you or next to you is. Yeah. And you're all traveling for essentially the same reasons, right? To get somewhere.
One of my favorite quotes is from the Onion newspaper. 95% of people stuck in traffic are polled, and they say transit is wonderful for everybody else.
For everybody else, yeah.
Yeah. And it's just how do you get people out of their cars is the big question. I mean, it's common in Europe, and it's common in back east maybe. But here, we're just used to our car is our liberty and freedom. And it's just a change in mindset has to happen.
It is a change in mindset. And frankly, the reason why that's there is because historically, we've made it really easy for people to get around by car. Mm-hmm. And I think you can look at the suburbs of Salt Lake where they're starting to... they developed in a way where they just have a few major roads that go east and west or north and south, really. And those roads are always full of cars. Well, that's because they've developed in a way that forces you to be in your car.
Yeah, you go downtown, look at how many massive parking lots we have still in downtown. Yeah. Would you like to see all those parking lots be occupied with big buildings so that people just don't have any other option?
I look at it as being occupied by people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a better outcome than being occupied by something that just sits there, right? And doesn't really, it contributes to the individual, like you said, with their own freedom and things like that, but it doesn't contribute to the city or the community. Yeah. And I think that's the hard part. I mean, you can look at on-street parking as a perfect example. Nowhere do we allow people to store their personal goods in the right-of-way.
Yeah.
Except for cars.
No, that's a good point.
We do it for free in most places. And so, that's a sign of the mentality that we have. And, we're not going to address our congestion issues in this valley or in this region by building more roads. Mm-hmm. There's this thing called induced demand, which if you make it easier to drive, i.e. adding lanes, building new roads, more people are going to drive. And so it doesn't actually help you solve your problem. And so that's why we need to have a multimodal transportation system that works for more people. We hear a lot about bike lanes and how no one uses them. And one of the reasons why you don't see bikes and bike lanes is because they're really efficient in moving the bikes through. And so while you're passing by the bike lane, you don't see it. But, we've got numbers and we've done some counts in the city historically that show actually when we have the right infrastructure in place, people will use their bikes.
Oh, yeah. I love this new bike lane they did along the I-80 or I-15.
Yeah, that's...
I-80, yeah.
Yeah, those are...
Yeah,
that's
awesome. I can whip right up to the office from my home in Sugarhouse. And yeah, it's cool. I think that it's as the mindset is slowly shifting, we can see more density, we can see fewer parking lots, and then the result could be less congestion because more people are going to realize, why would I drive my car to downtown if I got a try to find an impossible parking spot. I'll just take tracks, or I'll take the train,
Yeah.
bus, whatever.
And a big part of that is having the land use that supports the density, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the only thing worse than low density urban sprawl is high density urban sprawl. And so, you have to, the land use patterns have to be a huge part of that. And you have to be able to, if you're going to live in a dense area, you have to be able to find a way to get to a grocery store easily, and get to a doctor's office, and get a haircut, and all of those types of things, and get the kids to school,
Start walking, getting on a bike.
Right,
Yeah.
but those are all with our land use patterns that have to be there in order to support a multimodal transportation system.
Yeah. Well, that feels like a good spot to wrap it up, I think.
All right.
Is there anything else you wanted to say?
I think I've said a lot.
Yeah. Went a lot longer than we thought, but I think it was a good conversation.
Good.
Yeah, well, thanks, Nick, for being on. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for watching the Utah Stories Show. My name is Richard Markosian, editor and publisher of Utah Stories Magazine. So for more information on Utah Stories Magazine and to be a part of this show, you can subscribe to our newsletter by visiting utahstories.com. You can follow us on Instagram at Utah Stories. You can follow us on YouTube and subscribe to our channel there as well. And something coming up next week that's quite exciting. It's our health and wellness issue of Utah Stories Magazine. And on the program, we brought on two ladies, Veronica Little, who is the program administrator for the Department of Health and Human Services for the state of Utah. We're going to be talking about the opioid epidemic and how close to 70,000 people a year are dying in the United States of opioid overdoses. It's kind of like this silent killer because it doesn't get a lot of attention in the mainstream media, and it's something everyone needs to know more about because chances are you have a loved one, a brother, sister, or a friend who's addicted to opioids, and you may or may not even know that they are. And so Veronica and I are going to talk about that. And then her colleague who works in the Suicide Prevention Center for the state of Utah, Kim Myers, will be on the program to talk to us about suicide in Utah and how and why it is has one of the highest suicide rates in the country. So be sure to tune in for those very important episodes next week, and thanks for watching.